Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today's video, broadly speaking, follows on from a video that I made earlier on Richard III. Was he framed or wasn't he? And if so, by whom? I'll be sure to leave that video linked in a card up here. In that video, I of course talk about the Prince in the Tower, who were missing, presumed dead, perhaps murdered during their uncle's reign. But I also talk about the fact that they were not the only boys in England with as good, if not better, a claim to the throne of England than Richard III himself had. There was another, and yet this boy was not targeted for assassination. His name was Edward Plantagenet. He was Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence. George, Duke of Clarence, was the younger brother of King Edward IV. However, most importantly, he was the elder brother of King Richard III. And because of the fact that he was the elder brother, there were many in England who believed that his children would have a better claim to the throne than Richard III himself did. Richard III countered this by saying that because George, Duke of Clarence, had been attainted for treason, he and his entire bloodline had been barred from inheriting the throne. Nevertheless, this was a rival claimant in England, but Richard does not move against him. This boy survived Richard's reign and lives into Henry VII's reign, where he is publicly executed for treason. But we aren't talking about him today. Today I want to talk about his sister, a woman who survives the upheavals and violence of the Wars of the Roses, who makes a good marriage, and also makes her way, for the most part successfully, at the Tudor court. That was until something went catastrophically wrong. She ends up in the Tower, and she is executed on the orders of Henry VIII in one of the most brutal and barbaric executions in our entire history. Her name was Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, and we're going to talk about her today. Margaret was born on the 14th of August 1473 to George, Duke of Clarence, and his wife Isabel Neville. She was the eldest daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick and Salisbury, known to history most commonly as Warwick the Kingmaker. On her father's side, as I mentioned, her uncles were Edward IV and the future Richard III. This meant that her first cousins were the Prince in the Tower, little Edward and Richard, and their elder sister, Elizabeth of York, who would become the wife of Henry Tudor, King Henry VII. Margaret was just 3 years younger than her cousin, the future ill-fated Edward V, and 3 days older than his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. When her uncle, Edward IV, passed away, it was of course assumed that her cousin would become king, and that is how it was announced. However, as we know, he never made it to his coronation, and before long, his uncle Richard had become Richard III. As I mentioned, Richard III claimed that Margaret's father's act of attainder barred his children from any claim to the throne. Equally, he disinherited the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth of York by claiming that their marriage had never been valid. As unsettling as we might imagine that this upheaval would have been for Margaret, it was not the first time that she would have known distress. She was already an orphan. Her father had died in 1478, allegedly executed in secret in the Tower of London by being drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine, while her mother had predeceased him by 2 years, dying in 1476. In September 1483, King Richard III sent Margaret and her brother Edward, these two orphan siblings, to live at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. Therefore, by the time she was 10, Margaret arguably had experienced more unrest and upheaval than most of us would experience in a lifetime. But it was not over yet. 2 years later, on the 22nd of October 1485, the Battle of Bosworth took place. Henry Tudor defeats Richard III to become Henry VII. He chose to date his rule from the 21st of August, the day before the battle. Henry VII's claim to the throne was tenuous. The Prince in the Tower were missing. Thus, Edward and Margaret could easily be set up as rival claimants to the Yorkist throne. It is perhaps for this reason that in the aftermath of his victory at Bosworth, Henry VII made the decision to move Margaret's brother Edward to the Tower of London. By 1487, false rumours had begun to circulate that Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, had died in the Tower. Upon hearing these rumours, they set up a pretender, Lambert Simnel, to pose as Edward. His supporters had him crowned in Dublin on the 24th of May, 1487, and they provided him with a military force in an attempt to claim the throne in his name. His forces were defeated at Stoke Field on the 16th of June, 1487. Through the setting up of this pretender and the fact that his supporters mounted an invasion of England to try and take the throne from him, Henry VII was reminded of the powerful position that Edward and Margaret held within England. To minimise her threat, Henry married Margaret to Richard Pole, who was the son of his mother's half-sister Edith. Richard Pole was not as high-born as Margaret, but then of course few were, but he was certainly not low-born. Richard became one of the most crucial members of Henry's regime. He was granted various high-profile positions and titles. He was Lord Chamberlain to Prince Arthur from 1493, and in April 1499 he officiated at the proxy wedding of Prince Arthur, Henry VII's eldest son, to Catherine of Aragon. He was elected to the Order of the Garter in the same year. He was also given the honour and responsibility of escorting Princess Margaret to Scotland for her to be married to James IV in 1503. Margaret and Richard had 5 children that would survive into adulthood. Henry, who would become the future Lord Montague, Arthur, Ursula, Reginald and Geoffrey. On the 21st of November 1499, Margaret would experience a personal familial tragedy, however. On this date, her brother Edward was executed for treason on Tower Hill. It was alleged that he had plotted to escape with another pretender to the English throne, Perkin Warbeck. Margaret would not be able to let the grief of this event consume her, however, because just over 2 years later, in December 1501, she was sent to serve Catherine of Aragon as Princess of Wales, and she stayed in this role until the death of Prince Arthur in 1502. The death of Arthur parted the women, but as history will show, Margaret's friendship and loyalty to Catherine would be strong and enduring. It would not be long before Margaret, like Catherine of Aragon, was herself a widow. Sir Richard Pole died in October 1504, and his death left Margaret struggling financially. Because of her financial troubles, she was forced to give up her son Reginald to the church. It would seem that in later life Reginald saw this as a total abandonment, and when, in 1536, his mother Margaret wrote to him to reprimand him for refusing to recognise Henry VIII's royal supremacy, he responded resentfully, quote, "You never took any care to provide for my living nor otherwise, as you did for other." In 1509, King Henry VII passed away, and his 17-year-old son ascended the throne as Henry VIII. At once he took as his wife his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. The pair were crowned together, and Margaret immediately became a member of Queen Catherine's chamber. Her role would be a prominent one, and would earn her ample reward, as a testament of the enduring nature of the friendship between these two women. In February 1512, Henry restored Margaret to the earldom of Salisbury. With that came all the lands which her brother Edward had held at the time of his death. Historians have read this act as, quote, a tacit recognition of the injustice of his execution. Margaret paid just 5,000 marks for her restoration, but by 1518 some of the lands were in question and had been repossessed, the king making a claim to ownership of them. Margaret, unfortunately, showed herself to be stubborn over this claim. This stubbornness is seen by many historians as a misstep on her part, perhaps the first mistake of many that would lead eventually to the complete rift between her and her king, Henry VIII. Nevertheless, as Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole was the first and, apart from Anne Boleyn, the only woman in 16th century England to hold a peerage title in her own right. By 1538, Margaret's gross annual income was £2,311, making her among the top 5 wealthiest peers in her generation, and potentially one of the most influential women in England. As a mark of her prominence, in May 1520, Margaret was appointed governess to the Princess Mary. However, she was removed from this position in July 1521, when her sons came under suspicion of being involved with the Duke of Buckingham's treason. Indeed, her daughter Ursula was married to Buckingham's son, Henry. Nevertheless, she was reappointed governess in 1525. By this point, Margaret had attempted to dispute with her king over parcels of land. She also now seemingly had ties to traitors, but that was not all. Relations between Margaret and King Henry VIII were damaged because of his great matter. Margaret showed open support for Catherine of Aragon and the Princess Mary, following Henry's decision to annul his marriage. In 1533, she took the great risk of refusing Henry's request to surrender the princess's jewels and plate. And when Mary's household was dissolved in December 1533, Margaret offered to serve the princess at her own expense. The offer was firmly refused. In another disaster, Margaret was connected with Elizabeth Barton, known as the Holy Maid of Kent, a young woman who claimed to have visions from God. In these visions, she said that God warned King Henry against marrying Anne Boleyn. In fact, she said that if he did so, he would not be king for even 1 month more, and that dogs would lick his blood. This was treason. Predicting the king's death, speaking of the king's death, even thinking of the king's death was an act against him. And Lady Margaret Pole was being tied to this woman and her treasonous prophecies. Additionally, it was found that she had tried to prevent the appointment of Cromwell's nominee as Prior of Bisham. Not only was she making Henry VIII into an enemy, but she was also making his leading counsellor Cromwell into one as well. For evidence of how far Lady Margaret Pole's relationship with King Henry VIII had broken down, we need to look at an exchange from 1535. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis asked that the now Lady Mary should again be placed under Margaret's care. Henry VIII exploded, describing the Countess as, quote, a fool of no experience. After Anne Boleyn's execution on the 19th of May 1536, Lady Margaret Pole returned to the royal court. There she had the potential to regain King Henry VIII's trust and favour. However, events unconnected to Margaret's own activities would mean that it would not be an easy journey back, because 1536, as I mentioned previously, was the year that her son Reginald announced his opposition to the royal supremacy, and he did so in a letter in defence of ecclesiastical unity, which arrived before Henry VIII in that same year of 1536. Margaret's son, safe in Italy, had placed her in an unspeakably dangerous position. It is believed by many that Henry VIII was absolutely furious with Reginald Pole, with his denial of the royal supremacy, and more than that he wanted vengeance. But he couldn't get access to Reginald Pole. As I mentioned, he was safely tucked away in Italy. So instead, he would resort to wreaking that vengeance on the family of Reginald Pole. In August 1538, Lady Margaret Pole's other son, Reginald's brother, Geoffrey, was arrested following the discovery that he had been in communication with his brother Reginald. With this, the whole family could be implicated. On the 12th of November 1538, it was the turn of Lady Margaret Pole herself. On this date, she was arrested and taken for interrogation. By all accounts, she defended herself and confessed to nothing. In May 1539, without a trial, perhaps because during her interrogation she had defended herself so well, Margaret was attainted for treason in Parliament. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography's entry on Lady Margaret Pole talks about this event and asserts the following, quote, in order to facilitate the endorsement of her attainder in the Lords, Cromwell produced a tunic, allegedly found in one of her coffers, which symbolised Reginald Pole's intention to marry Mary and restore papal authority in England. In all likelihood, this tunic was fabricated by Cromwell, as Warblington and the Countess's coffers had been thoroughly searched at her arrest in November 1538, and it is hard to believe that it did not come to light until 6 months later. By November 1539, Lady Margaret Pole had been moved from the home of William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton in Cowdray, to the Tower of London. At the Tower of London, Lady Margaret Pole lived in fine style. She was kept lavishly, as befitted her station in life. Henry VIII paid for her to have access to good food, a waiting woman, and new clothing. In March 1541, the Queen's own tailor was paid £11, 16 shillings and 4p as a reimbursement for apparel bought and made for Margaret Pole, and a month later, a further 66 shillings and 8p was spent on necessaries for her. Nevertheless, just 1 month after Henry VIII's purse had made this expenditure for necessaries for Lady Margaret Pole. At 7 o'clock on the morning of the 27th of May, 1541, Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was taken from her rooms to a scaffold erected within the tower for the purpose. Accounts assert that she only learnt she was to die on the same morning. After commending her soul to God, asking the small group present to pray for the royal family, and requesting to be remembered to Princess Mary, she suffered at the hands of, quote, a wretched and blundering youth, who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 years old at the time of her execution, and this fact, coupled with the details of the brutality of her execution, continue to strike horror in the minds of those who learn of it. Lady Margaret Pole's body was laid to rest in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. It was there that her remains were discovered in 1876. 10 years after the rediscovery of her remains, Lady Margaret Pole, in 1886, was beatified by Pope Leo XIII. So I'd love to know what you think of this video, what you think of the life, death and legacy of Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Do you agree with some historians who assert that by looking at the facts of her imprisonment and execution, we can see that by this point at least, King Henry VIII is more tyrant than king? Let me know in the comments section down below, or come and find me over on my social media. As always, I'll be leaving the links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box, so you can follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to this channel, and while you're there, why not hit the bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.